I've always known that there were limits in life. My job as a police officer taught me some important things, one of which is that fear serves a purpose. But in 2008, in Brownsville, Texas, I went through something no one should ever experience. At that time, I was at the peak of my career. I was proud of my uniform and believed in what I did. My name is Ramon Castillo, and I took a call that changed my life. I received the call one Sunday afternoon, when everything was unusually quiet. The report said an entire family had disappeared overnight, the Montoyas. They lived on a property a bit out of the way, in a rural area where there wasn't much movement. The wife, the husband, and 2 children, quiet people, according to the neighbors, with no apparent issues, but something already felt wrong. A couple of friends of the Montoyas mentioned that they had been talking about strange noises, like footsteps around the house and shadows in the field. When I got in the patrol car, I could only think that maybe it was just a case of an unannounced trip. But deep down, something told me it wasn't that simple. When I arrived at the house, I was greeted by a scene that, to this day, I remember clearly. All the lights were on, as if the family had prepared for a quiet evening. There were plates with food remnants on the table, chairs pushed back, some jackets hanging on the backs. The fluorescent lights cast shadows inside the house, making the place feel empty in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't just the absence of people. It was the silence that weighed in the air. I called out for the family, even though I knew there would be no answer. My footsteps echoed through the room as I observed the details: the folded newspaper on the armchair, the children's toys left by the doorway. But no clue told me where they were. On the kitchen counter, I found the mother's cell phone, as if it had been hurriedly abandoned, maybe after an interrupted call. I started to have the sense that something was deeply wrong. I stepped outside into the backyard, trying to follow any trail that might lead me to where they could have gone. The place was surrounded by trees, creating a dark corridor around the property, and the field just ahead stretched as far as my eyes could see. I noticed footprints, marks that indicated someone had walked toward the field. At first, I thought it was the trail of someone leaving the house, but soon the marks disappeared, fading away as if whoever had left them had simply vanished. I went a little further, trying to find something else. But when I took the last step where the footprints ended, I was overwhelmed by an inexplicable feeling. The stillness was absolute, dense, muffling any other sound. The wind, which had been gently blowing before, seemed to stop, and I stood there, trying to understand what was happening. Nothing but silence. And for the first time in years of patrol, I felt a tightness in my chest that made me step back. I went back to the house to finish the inspection. I grabbed my radio and contacted the base, reporting the disappearance. Later, while doing a final sweep, I heard a snap behind me. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but saw nothing. I continued inspecting every detail, trying to understand what could have happened to that family. And even though I didn't want to admit it, a part of me knew that something was very wrong. It wasn't just their disappearance. It was the sense that they weren't the only things that had disappeared. After that night, I went back several times to the Montoya property. I still felt like I had left something unfinished. The official investigation was underway, but each visit seemed to bring something new. The property remained untouched, as if waiting for the family to return at any moment. The neighbors, what few there were nearby, rarely showed up, and those who ventured up to the fence would just watch the house from a distance, too afraid to enter. In the first week, some of them called me over to talk. Most avoided speaking directly about the disappearance, preferring veiled and indirect expressions. "These lands have always been strange," a lady told me, clutching her shawl. "There are things no one sees. But they're there." She didn't say more, but her eyes were sincere, deep, as though she knew something I couldn't understand. Others mentioned noises at night, but when they tried to explain, they hesitated, as if the words were escaping them. Time passed, and while investigating other cases, I couldn't stop thinking about the Montoyas. They were an ordinary family with no history of problems. And somehow, I felt that the responsibility for finding some kind of answer was mine. I began to spend sleepless nights trying to piece together the puzzle. At home, my wife, Maria, tried to calm me down. "You've done everything you could, Ramon," she would say, but I knew that wasn't true. My mind would return over and over to that field where the footprints had ended. I knew there was something there, a response, or at least a clue, but it wasn't just that. I felt a strange presence in that place. I started to notice this in small details: the sound of footsteps when I was alone, a faint noise in the background of the radio. When I tried to sleep, I felt like I wasn't alone in the room. Yet every time I looked, I saw nothing. In the second week, I decided to spend more time patrolling at night. I would drive down the deserted road that led to the Montoya house and observe the trees surrounding the property. I started to notice the nights seemed longer, which was impossible, but it felt real. Every time I looked at the open field, I had the impression of seeing a silhouette moving in the distance, almost out of sight. But I denied it. I didn't want to think I was becoming paranoid. My obsession grew, and I knew it was affecting my work. My colleagues noticed my lack of sleep and the distant look in my eyes, but no one asked anything. The truth was, no one wanted to get involved with the Montoya case. It was as if the entire town had gone silent about the disappearance, preferring to ignore what couldn't be explained. However, for me, this was torture. I wanted answers, but at the same time, I feared what I might discover. In the third week, something happened. Coming home late at night, I saw a mark on the ground in front of my door. It was a footprint, a mark similar to the ones I had seen on the Montoya property. The shape was familiar, but something was wrong. The footprint was deeper, as if whoever had made it was much heavier than an average person. Maria noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't speak. I just went inside, quickly closing the door, and stayed silent for the rest of the night. The weight of that footprint stayed with me until dawn, and with it, the feeling that wherever the Montoya family was, I was getting closer to discovering it, one way or another. That night, I decided I couldn't live without understanding what was happening. I had to return to the Montoya property. The sky was cloudy, and a light rain had started to fall, creating a heavy and damp atmosphere. As I approached the house, the car's headlights briefly lit up the dusty windows, but there was nothing but darkness behind them. I got out of the car and walked to the entrance, the ground covered with dry leaves crunching under my feet. The door was ajar, as if inviting me in. I hesitated, took a deep breath, and with a gentle push, I entered the house. The inside was a maze of memories. The smell of mildew and old wood mixed with a faint sense of sadness. The furniture was positioned strangely, as if it had been moved recently. Each step I took seemed to echo, amplifying the loneliness. But it was when I reached the kitchen that something truly disturbed me. On the table, there was a plate with food remnants that seemed fresh, even though I knew the house had been empty for weeks. The utensils were arranged meticulously, and something inside me began to stir. Someone's been here, I thought. Someone might still be here. A shiver ran down my spine. My eyes fixated on the window, where the rain was now beating harder. The sound of the drops mixed with a faint whisper that seemed to come from outside. I looked closer, and in the darkness, I saw a shadow moving among the trees. My heart began to race, and I hesitated, trying to gather the courage to approach the window. What was that? The shadow appeared humanoid, but it didn't move like a person. It was almost as if it was contorting, sliding between the trunks with an unnatural fluidity. I felt paralyzed, unable to look away. Then, in a sudden motion, the figure disappeared, as if swallowed by the darkness. The adrenaline surged, and I knew I had to leave. The moment I decided to turn back, I heard a sound behind me. It was as if someone had closed the kitchen door. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The house had returned to silence, but the echo of the sound still rang in my ears. I ran out the front door, the rain falling harder, soaking my shirt as I distanced myself from the house. When I got in the car, I tried to control my breathing. What did I see? Who was there? The way home felt longer, and with every second, the feeling that someone was following me grew. When I got home, I locked the door and sat on the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But in my mind, I already knew the Montoyas weren't gone. They were still there, watching, waiting. Finally, I saw an opening between the trees and threw myself out of the forest, landing on the ground with a thud. When I looked back, the shadows stood still, just watching. The child's scream still echoed in my head, but now everything was silent. I was out of the forest, but the feeling that something was watching me persisted. I struggled to get up and ran toward my house. Fear propelled me, and the thought of Maria made me hurry. What I had discovered left me confused and terrified. What did those figures want? And what had happened to the Montoyas? When I arrived at home, I found the door ajar. Maria was still there, but when I stepped inside, her appearance left me in shock. She was standing in the living room, her eyes lost, her expression blank. A chill ran down my spine. "Maria?" I called, but she didn't respond. The silence was oppressive, and something was very, very wrong. But what did this mean? The sight of Maria standing in the room, with that distant look, froze me. Her expression was the same as the girl in the forest, an unsettling apathy that seemed to indicate something had changed inside her. "Maria," I called again, but she kept staring into the void, as if trapped in a dream. Fear began to root itself in me. Whatever had happened in the forest, something had followed me home. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. The silence was so thick that I could almost hear my heartbeat. I had to act. With effort, I moved closer to her. "Maria, please, listen to me." I touched her arm, but the contact felt like touching a block of ice. She slowly turned her head, but her eyes seemed lost, as if they weren't really there. "What happened to you?" I asked, a plea disguised as a command. "They're coming," was the only answer she could articulate, her voice trembling, but with a certainty that made my stomach turn. "They always come." The fear in her expression made my body shake. I remembered the girl in the forest, the dark laugh, the empty stare. It was as if Maria was becoming something I couldn't recognize. I looked around, trying to find any sign of normalcy in the house. The familiar objects now seemed strange, as if they were remnants of a life that was no longer mine. The door was ajar, and the streetlight was coming in, but the feeling that we were being watched weighed on us. "We need to get out of here," I suggested, feeling the urgency grow. "We need to go to the police station. We need help," but Maria slowly shook her head, her gaze still distant. "It's no use, Ramon. They're already here." The idea of stepping outside terrified me, but her presence left me with no choice. What had happened to her? How did she know about them? On impulse, I took her hand and gently pulled her. "Maria, please, let's go." "I won't leave you here." She hesitated, but then her eyes lit up with a spark of clarity. "We need to hide," she said, her voice now more firm. "If they get to us, there's no way out." I didn't know what was happening, but I realized that the urgency of the situation was starting to create a connection between us. The fight to save Maria and myself became the focus. Then let's go to the basement, I suggested, remembering it was the most isolated place in the house. The idea of being trapped there made me uneasy, but there was no other option. And even though I didn't know exactly what the threat was, her determination spread through me. Let's go. We went down to the basement, and the darkness enveloped us. The smell of mold and old wood hit us, but the feeling of being away from the light provided some comfort, even if temporary. I closed the door and turned the key, hearing the click that seemed to echo in the dark. It was dark, and the light from the lantern barely illuminated the space. Maria sat in a corner, her hands trembling. "If they find us, there will be no return," she murmured, her eyes lost again. The fear in her voice hit me like a punch, and I knew the situation was more serious than I had imagined. The thought that we could be caught by something beyond our control was terrifying. I looked around, trying to identify something we could use as defense. "Maria, do you remember anything about what happened with the Montoyas? What did they say?" My voice was firm, but inside, anxiety was growing like a storm. She looked at me, her expression beginning to clear. They were worried about the noises, about what was hiding in the forest, but no one believed them. They said it was just animal noises, that it was just ghost stories. There was a fragility in her voice, but the determination was beginning to resurface. "Then we need to prepare. If these things are real, we need to be ready. We need to figure out what it is." The plan began to form in my mind. It wasn't just about survival. It was about facing whatever was chasing us. With a renewed purpose, I searched for tools that were scattered in a corner of the basement. This might help. As I searched, I realized that time was passing. The tension in the air was palpable, and I knew we didn't have much time before they came. Whatever that meant. "Stay close to me," I told Maria. "No matter what happens, we're facing this together." A sudden knock on the basement door made my heart race. I looked at Maria, who froze in place, her eyes wide. The sound was rhythmic, as if something was testing the security of our hiding place. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice choked. "I don't know," I replied, adrenaline pumping through my veins. "But we need to be ready." The knocking continued, and with each sound, the weight of the atmosphere grew. I was sure something was about to happen, and the only thing I could do was wait and prepare for what was coming. The knocking stopped abruptly, and silence settled in. Panic began to consume me. Whatever was on the other side knew we were here. With a swift movement, I grabbed a metal bar I had found, a desperate attempt to ensure some protection. Maria looked at me, breathing irregularly, and I could feel the weight of the situation on our chests. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her eyes now full of fear. What we were about to face was uncertain, but the determination to protect Maria was all I knew. The silence in the basement was deafening, but something inside me began to stir. The feeling that we were in imminent danger forced me to look for a way to confront whatever was chasing us. Maria's expression between fear and determination inspired me to act. "Maria, we need to focus. Whatever is out there, it can't catch us by surprise," I declared, my voice firm. She nodded, breathing deeply. The air in the basement seemed to push down, but I had to be her anchor, the point of stability in the midst of chaos. "Remember, everything we know about these things is based on stories. Let's use them to our advantage." Her hands trembled, but I saw a spark of determination light up in her eyes. We decided to use what we had on hand. In the back of the basement, I found some candles and matches. "We can use this to guide us if the light goes out," Maria said as I lit a candle. The flickering light illuminated her features, revealing a determination I hadn't seen before. "We have to stay calm, okay?" I knew she needed support, even though anxiety pulsed in my chest. "Okay," she replied, her voice firmer now. "And if they're coming, we can't show fear." Those words resonated like a mantra. I knew fear was contagious, and if I let it take over, she would too. I looked around, trying to find a way to protect our space. The basement was filled with objects, toolboxes, candles, and even an old wooden cabinet. "We can make a barricade with these things," I suggested. "If we can block the door, at least we'll have some time." With a nod, she began to help, her energy renewed by the idea of fighting back. We worked together in silence, the sounds of our activity being the only noise in the darkness. With every object we moved, I felt a small wave of hope. We were together, and there was strength in that. As we worked, a new feeling began to settle in, the idea that we could face this, that we weren't alone. When we finished stacking the boxes and furniture against the door, we left only a small opening. The candlelight cast shadows on the walls, creating a nearly hypnotic effect. "Are we ready?" Maria asked, her voice trembling slightly, but there was a new firmness in her words. "Ready enough," I replied, even though uncertainty still lingered inside me. At that moment, I realized that our struggle wasn't just against something external, but also an internal battle. Whatever they were, the real fight was against the fear that had taken over our lives. With that in mind, I decided it was time to confront the truth. "Maria, we need to talk about what's happening. What do you know about these noises? About what happened to the Montoyas?" The question seemed to hang in the air, but I needed to know. She hesitated, her gaze shifting to the shadows. "The noises are real. What we hear, it's not just the wind. I've heard things before, in the distance. Voices. Whispers." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but I could see her resolve growing stronger with each word. The weight of the situation settled heavily on us. The silence was crushing, but I knew we had to hold on to each other. The unknown was all we had left, but there was power in facing it together. "We'll get through this," I said, more for my own sake than for hers. But as I looked at Maria, her face illuminated by the candlelight, I knew she believed it too. We were ready for whatever came next. "I don't know," I answered, feeling a chill run down my spine. "But we need to leave now." Carefully, we opened the door and looked down the hallway. The lantern's light revealed shadows cast on the walls, and the scratching grew louder, as if something was closing in on us. "Hurry, to the stairs," I said, pulling her to follow my lead. We descended quickly, the sound intensifying with every step we took. We were moments away from confronting whatever was chasing us, and the adrenaline was rushing through my veins. The scratching followed us as we ran down the hallway toward the stairs. We could hear a low, heavy breathing sound. "To the basement." "Let's hide there," I suggested, remembering there was a heavy door we could lock. Maria nodded, panic written across her face, and we ran as fast as our legs would allow, dodging furniture and shadows that seemed to stretch toward us. When we reached the basement door, I entered and slammed it shut, turning the key with a strength I didn't know I had. The feeling of relief was brief, but I knew it was only temporary. "What was that?" Maria whispered, out of breath. Her eyes were fixed on the door, waiting for something to burst through at any second. I don't know," I replied, and the honesty in my words sent a shiver through me. "I think this place isn't just abandoned. There's something here, something that doesn't want us to leave." The silence stretched between us, and all I could hear was our breathing slowing down. The basement seemed safer, but the air still felt heavy, filled with an invisible presence watching us, hidden in the shadows. I realized this wasn't a simple phenomenon. It was something much older, a presence that seemed to be part of the house itself. Maria held the lantern tightly, and her gaze was fixed on a crack in the far wall of the basement. The lantern's light revealed a cold draft seeping through it. "Maybe there's another way out," she whispered, trying to make sense of the crack. Curious, I approached and touched the cold wall. It was as if something was vibrating on the other side, like there was an energy waiting to be released. "It could be an exit," I murmured, not fully believing my own words. But any hope seemed better than the uncertainty hanging over us. We began pushing on the wall, and to our surprise, it gave way, revealing a narrow passage leading even deeper into the darkness. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Maria asked, her voice full of doubt. "It might be the only way," I replied, though part of me knew this passage didn't promise anything good. Reluctantly, she nodded, and we moved forward, the lantern lighting only a few feet ahead. The corridor was narrow and damp, and the smell of mold filled the air, mixed with something else. Something rotten I couldn't quite identify. The longer we walked, the stronger the smell became, and the breathing we'd heard earlier seemed to echo from all sides, as if we were surrounded by something invisible. Suddenly, a sound came from behind us, footsteps, but not like ours. They were dragged, slow but deliberate, as if something was following us closely. Maria stopped, her gaze fixed behind me. "Something's coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. I felt a chill run up my spine, and the lantern shook in my hand as I slowly turned to face the dark corridor. Nothing, just shadows and silence. But we knew it was there, watching us, waiting for the slightest mistake. I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling that something would catch up to us at any moment. Maria held my hand, and we could both feel each other's fear, the adrenaline pulsing between us. We didn't say another word, knowing that any unnecessary sound might betray us. Eventually, we reached a spacious room, with damp old stone walls covered in what looked like inscriptions. The marks were strange, almost as if they'd been made by claws. "This isn't an exit," I murmured, feeling terror rise within me. "It's a place of ritual," Maria added, her voice barely audible. The air seemed to vibrate, and a wave of nausea washed over me. We were in the heart of whatever inhabited the house. Before I could react, a shadow moved across one of the walls, and a guttural sound echoed through the room, like a whisper coming from every corner at once. "Get out of here," I shouted, trying to pull Maria back, but the door we had come through slammed shut on its own. We were trapped, and the only thing left was to face whatever was there. Suddenly, the lantern flickered, plunging us into complete darkness. I could hear Maria's breath beside me, quick and shallow, as we tried to adjust. But then, I realized we weren't alone. The sensation of cold hands stretched out to my shoulder, pulling me with force. My scream blended with the muffled laughter echoing around us. When the lantern finally flickered back on, casting a faint yellow light, I was alone. Maria had vanished. My hands shook, and my short breaths echoed in the stone room. I searched the room desperately, calling her name, my voice breaking the silence with a desperation I couldn't contain. But there was no sign of Maria. All that was left was the echo of my words and a strange mark on the floor, a symbol that seemed to be made of dried blood. I recoiled, realizing the place was some kind of altar. Something or someone had made that to trap anyone who ventured too far. And we were the victims. The symbol began to vibrate, emitting a subtle noise. The instinct to escape overwhelmed me, and without looking back, I ran down the corridor that had brought us here. When I finally reached the basement stairs, I found the door open. A mix of relief and terror washed over me as I stumbled through, nearly falling onto the floor of the house. I looked back once more, hoping to see something, any sign of Maria. But all I found was the same dark corridor, silent and still. As if the place had returned to its original state, as if nothing we'd experienced had really happened there. I climbed the stairs and left the house as quickly as I could, not caring to look back. The night's cold touched my skin, and only then did I realize I was free, but alone. Yet, the relief was quickly replaced by an unbearable emptiness. Maria was still in there, trapped in something I would never understand. In the days that followed, I returned to the place countless times, hoping to find her, or at least an explanation for what had happened. But every time I got close, I felt a weight that forced me to retreat. The house seemed a little farther away with each visit, as if it was dissolving, becoming a dark memory that only I carried. Eventually, I had to accept that Maria was gone, swallowed by that place and whatever lived there. And I, left behind, was the only witness. Years later, the echo of what happened still haunts me, especially on nights of absolute silence, when I feel that presence following me, like a shadow that will never leave. Years passed, but not a single day went by when I didn't remember that night. Maria's face still appears in my dreams, always shrouded in shadows, always with that look of terror I saw for a brief second before we lost each other forever. I avoid talking about what happened. There's a line between what others would believe and what I lived. Even the few friends I have left think it was a tragedy, a desperation that pushed me into fantasies and illusions. And maybe they're right. Sometimes I even question if it really happened the way I remember it. But on the darkest nights, something breaks the silence. A sound faint echoing through the walls of my house, reminding me of those voices, that altar, that symbol I could never erase from my memory. The voice calls to me, and I close my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to forget. But it gets closer with each passing night. Maria is still there, and maybe she's just waiting for the right time to take me to the same fate.